David, welcome to Contemplative, the Contemplative Path. Thank you so much for coming and joining us and sharing your insights and your thoughts about the future. I know you for long enough to know you are a man of many interests, and looking at the books surrounding you behind you, I think I would say you have many interests and an eclectic mind. But at the same time, I would like to begin by asking you this question: what is the unifying focus of your thought and of your interests of your life? What's your simplifying, organizing focus?
Well, I actually have three, so I can't answer the question immediately in terms of one, and they're reflected on my business card. In the card, you might see that there's a tree inside an acorn.
Yes.
And around it there are three phrases. The first is inspiring purpose, the second transforming worldviews, and the third is living your truth. And each of these reflect an aspect of my work. So the inspiring purpose is to do with what I have been doing with young people, and it's a project of that name, Inspiring Purpose. Transforming Worldviews is very much my work with the Scientific and Medical Network and the Galileo Commission. And Living Your Truth is my approach to life in terms of trying to be true to myself and living authentically from my center.
Well, 3 in 1. You must have some Irish blood, because the Irish can never answer a question directly.
Okay. Yes.
No, thank you. Well,
it's Trinitarian, maybe.
Trinitarian, 3 in 1. Good. Well, you published a book some time ago called A New Renaissance, A New Renaissance. And in many ways, your interests and your vision is a Renaissance vision, linking deep roots in tradition and indigenous wisdom and in scientific knowledge to the spiritual. How do you see the various possibilities that we are facing as a human family now as we emerge from this COVID-19 crisis? At least we hope we're emerging from it, but we're probably embarking on a path that's going to take us through deeper and more disruptive crises. What do you see the various or the main possibilities that we could find ourselves engaging with?
Well, I'd just like to start by talking a little bit about Renaissance and the use of the word Renaissance. We ran a number of conferences on a new Renaissance, towards a new Renaissance. And oddly enough, the new newsletter, the latest issue of which will be going out tomorrow, is called Towards a New Renaissance. And so the phrase is recurring, if you like. And as you know, it implies rebirth, which implies going back to something where there was a flowering of really essential ideas in previous eras. And the Renaissance itself was not only intellectual, philosophical, spiritual, but also primarily known as being artistic. And so it runs across the disciplines, and it also implies, I think, in our case, that there's an element of decline going on in our civilization. I've been reading recently some of the work of a man called William Ophuls, where he talks about the decadence of civilizations. And as we know also from life, when you get a death, then you also get the possibility of a rebirth. But we don't really know how long all these processes are going to take, how long all this is going to go on, and what sort of emergences we'll manage to tune into. I mean, for me, the important thing culturally is that, as Arnold Toynbee suggested, it's always a creative minority that provides and embodies the new ideas. And so I see myself, in a sense, as part of a broadly based creative minority of trying to bring about a more adequate and integral worldview, and many people are working on this, and one which includes but transcends the current scientific view, but is really based on a deep recognition of the oneness of life and the oneness of mind, which for me implies an ethic of interconnectedness, an ethic based on the golden rule. And I think a lot of our fundamental challenges at the moment arise from this perception of separateness, and separateness in terms of egos and competition, so that we don't behave like we're coming from that oneness. And if we had a deeper realization of this, and we may come back to this later, then I think this could provide an impulse for being able to move forward. I think that if you look at this in traditional sort of dualistic terms, there is an element of light and dark struggle going on. Although I'm wary of characterizing myself as on the good side and others on the bad side, because that gives rise to projections, and the projection means that you might not understand the mote in your own eye when you're looking out to criticize other people. So there's a danger of this polarization and indeed even demonization. But I think maybe the fundamental thing I'd like to say is to do with the future in terms of freedom and control. And to me, this has a lot to do with how do you actually understand the human being? If you understand the human being already as a machine, then machines are there to be controlled. And the technology is coming online where the distinction between humans and machines may be blurred. But for me, freedom fundamentally resides in inwardness, in the sense that we have of being rooted in something deeper than the surface identity. And so that the choosing freedom, which is also choosing life, which is also choosing love, seems to me to be the fundamental choice. And it comes back to a choice of fundamental values. And I'd really like to have this debate in public, or have this debate going on in public. You know, what are the values implicit in our current culture, in the way it's operating? And what values do we need to put in place so that we could renew our culture?
I read the other day, I hadn't come across this date before, 1177 BC, which was it's the date that the historians who like one date to denote the end of one period, the beginning of another. It was the end of the late Bronze Age, and it was a very short period of time where a civilization, interconnected civilization in the Middle East, and the trade routes and the big cities and the agricultural systems all collapsed, and they entered into a period of the dark ages for 200 or 300 years, apparently. So we have dates like this where we look back and we can see the rise and fall of civilizations. You mentioned Toynbee, I suppose, and Spengler, and then we say 476 was the year when the Roman Empire ended, and so on. But there's something about 2020 that makes you wonder whether this might not be a year that historians of the future invoke in the same way as a milestone. And if that is the case, and certainly there's a lot of people who feel we can't go back, we're going to change, there's something radical has happened, why do you think this epidemic, terrible though it has been in many ways, but it's probably in some ways not as bad as, say, the Spanish flu in 1918. But what was it, do you think, that makes us feel today that this is a turning point?
Well, of course, that's a very good question. I think that there are different sort of frames that you could answer that in. One frame for me is the earth. And you may have seen one or two of these videos going around where the Earth tells us, what the message of the coronavirus is, and that we are in overreach. We go into Earth Overshoot Day now at the end of July, when we used up more than the year's renewable resources. There are too many of us consuming too much, creating too much pollution. And we've seen from images, NASA images of Wuhan and other places over the last few weeks, that if we slow down our activity, then the pressure we put on the environment correspondingly reduces. So that at one level, that's the sort of wake-up call, if you like, that we've received. And I think that this applies both at a collective and an individual level, that we don't change until we sort of hit the buffers. Mm-hmm. And there's a business philosopher called Jim Rohn, and he's one of the people who said, other people may have said the same, that there are only two reasons that people change. One is inspiration and the other is desperation. And of course, inspiration is less painful, but desperation may be more effective. And then this takes me back, for instance, to all my work that I did at an earlier stage on near-death experiences. And so there's a sense in which there's a planetary, a mild, I think, but a planetary near-death experience, which my friend Michael Grosso was talking about in the 1980s with his book, The Final Choice. So I think it's given people time to reflect, but then if I use another scientific analogy, the question is the perturbation to the system large enough to force it to reconfigure? And that's a really important question. So that within the thought of Ilya Prigogine, who won a Nobel Prize for his ideas on dissipative structures, if the perturbation within the dynamic system is small, then the system goes back to its preset dynamics. But if it's large, it then reconfigures completely. And we don't quite know where we are, because there'll be a lot of people, like in the Sunday Times headline I read a few weeks ago, spend, spend, spend. That's what they wanted us to do, which is exactly what President Bush said after 9/11. Spend, spend, spend. Get out there and carry on as before, only more so.
Yeah. Yes. The cycles historically that we can see, we have emerged from cycles of the rise and fall of civilizations and so on. They create perspectives and insights into the way the human being develops and makes progress, personally and collectively. The mystical traditions have also grown out of these cycles, I suppose. But maybe the conflict of good and bad, or light and dark, that you were talking about earlier, is really going to be experienced in the force of Maya or reality. There's going to be a very strong inducement to believe the illusion that we can go back and that everything will be as it was before, or we don't have to worry about any of these doomsters telling us that the world is coming to an end. On the one hand, which is very seductive and a huge amount of persuasion present in it. On the other hand, that small minority, a creative minority, or the critical mass of people who are resistant to that and prepared to look with uncertainty, accepting uncertainty, which is frightening to live without certainty, but as at things as they are. I mean, that seems to me. In your historical perspective, do you believe in progress? Many people would say we seem to be regressing now, but do you think we retreat in order to progress?
Well, I think the idea of progress emerged strongly in the 18th century. And it's basically an Enlightenment idea, because in the past, people thought the Golden Age was in the past rather than in the future. And so that was reversed during the 18th century. And I have a number of books in my library. For instance, J.B. Bury wrote a book on the idea of progress. And so it's been thoroughly analyzed. And I think this was then reinforced in the 19th century by the theory of evolution. Again, you can ask, well, is evolution, can you actually equate evolution with progress? And then you have to ask yourself, well, what kind of progress are you talking about? And here, Albert Schweitzer said that there are three forms of progress. And he said that there's technical progress. There is progress in the socialization of the human being, and there's progress in spirituality. And he said that the last one was the fundamental, was really what fundamental progress was about, which really means what the phrase he used was, at a later phase in the same small book called Reverence for Life, was our task is to become more finely and deeply human. And I've always found that a beautiful phrase, and one that I can relate to, in terms of this, the refinement of one's consciousness is a process of sort of spiritual alchemy, if you like. But also the deepening implies also a deepening of compassion as well as a deepening of understanding. And so I think that we need to be very careful about eliding these different forms of progress and mistaking technical progress as progress in inverted commas. And Aldous Huxley went further in Ends and Means in 1942, and he said that technical progress has merely provided us with a more efficient way of going backwards. So I think these are all points of reflection. So I do agree with Schweitzer that the progress in fundamentals has to do with evolving the depth and richness of our humanity.
Those three types of progress that Schweitzer described remind me of what von Hugel describes as the three dimensions of religion: the institutional, the intellectual, and the mystical.
Ah, interesting. Yes.
And if one of them, usually it's the mystical that ends up being marginalized or persecuted by the institutional, and the intellectual, it becomes the sort of the enforcement agency of the institution. So, so this might lead us into the spiritual aspect of what we are talking about and what we are going through. I met maybe we could begin just with consciousness. I met a genius not long ago who in artificial intelligence. He had huge success and and passionate curiosity and open-mindedness, and certainly wasn't worried about the idea of artificial intelligence taking over the world. He wasn't deceived by that, but he had a driving curiosity. And I said, "What are you most curious about?" He said, "I'm looking for the source of consciousness." And so I said, "Well, have you where are you looking for it? Have you done any meditation?" He said, "No, I've never done any meditation. I've never had time to read about it even. I've never even read it." So I thought it was a little bit missed opportunity for interested in consciousness. You think you would tune into this great tradition. But it's clear that what we're talking about now are not just ideas and strategies and policies and politics, although they will hopefully express a change of mind that takes place. But it has to be a change of consciousness, not just a change of ideas. What is for you the source of consciousness?
Well, I think you have to go inside. I mean, it reminds me slightly of a very amusing story connected with Jacob Needleman. When he just finished his PhD, he had an interview with Suzuki, the great Zen master, and he was just sort of getting into his stride about what is the nature of reality and what is consciousness. And Suzuki stopped him completely in his tracks and said, "Who is asking the question?"
Yes.
Who is asking the question? And of course, that reflexively, in a Zen-like way, put him straight back into himself. And because he was very inexperienced at that level, and so the rest of the questions that he was going to ask Suzuki just sort of fell by the wayside. Well, he tackled the process that was going on inside him. And so you can't, the consciousness in search of itself is what we experience as our center and as a center, if I can put it that way. And so the quest for it is maybe the wrong way of looking at it, because if you just sit, as we know only too well, and then all of this arises in its own way, we don't have to go anywhere, and we don't have to look for anything, because we are it. And we can occasionally reach this sort of witness state of being aware. But I was struck a few months ago when I was reading a book about gnosis and Gnosticism, and the two different forms of baptism. And one, the baptism of the soul, this is Tim Freaky talking about this. He said, this is when you realize that you are part of the whole. And then the baptism of the spirit, which is gnosis, is when you realize immediately that you are the whole. And that's a critical move, I think, to move from being part of the whole. And that's how I was thinking when I wrote my book, Whole in One, on the ethic of interconnectedness 30 years ago. And but now I see that I hadn't understood that reflexive sense of oneness that is the basis, where the I am is reflected and understood immediately and intuitively by the I am that is me and the I am that is you. And what Thomas Troward quite arrestingly says, he was somebody who was lecturing on mental science in the early 1900s, is that what can say I am in me is the same as what says I am in you, which I found a very revealing insight. And so look within, I think, is the answer. What's the source of consciousness?
What Suzuki said to Needleman is of course what Ramana Maharshi said to nearly everybody, which is who was asking the question, and the self-inquiry was the practice. I'd like to pick up this question of spiritual practice with you in a moment, but he said, the essential practice is to keep, as it were, letting go of the I thought by questioning it. Where does it come from? And so you keep on, as it were, tracing it back to its ultimate source, which is, for him, he would say, the self, which is a non-reflective consciousness, non-self-reflective consciousness. But what you were saying also throws up a contrast with something Simone Weil says about this, which is that our sense of existence is false, because only God is I am. And in order for God to emit or manifest or create us and everything else, he had to withdraw from himself, sort of to suck in, withdraw from himself, empty himself. And therefore, this is unimaginable, but therefore it created the space in which other things could seem to exist. And they have an existence which we take to be real existence. And what we have to learn to do is to surrender that, is to say, I don't exist, actually. And it's in that emptying of ourselves, giving up of ourselves, that we discover our oneness with the divine.
But then who is the I that doesn't exist? You see, that's a sort of reciprocal of the Zen question, because I think that the I that doesn't exist is not the I that I was talking about. But I understand why Simone Weil would say that. Also because there's a sense in which she needed the otherness of the divine, the transcendence of the divine. But all deep spiritual traditions suggest that the immanent is the transcendent is the immanent. So if you, into deep darkness fall those who travel only the path of the immanence and immanent, and same with the transcendent. And so you need to pull those together, as it were. But I do agree that this sense of surrender is key, and in just reaching a settled level, rather than floating about or bobbing about even on the surface. But I just one other thing about Simone Weil, which I think would be nice to add, because I do keep on coming back to her. And I discovered down here that one of the great Cathar figures called Déodat Rocher, who lived from 1877 to 1978. He was the founding editor of the Journal d'études Cathar, the Journal of Cathar Studies, and he wrote over 100 articles for this journal. And he had a correspondence with Simone Weil in the early 1940s. And these letters are in the museum, which I visited. And so I had a look at these handwritten manuscripts. And she was talking about science and modern thinking. And she said, and this was the phrase that really stuck with me, she said that these provide une nourriture spirituelle insuffisante, an insufficient spiritual nourishment. And that really made me think about what is a sufficient spiritual nourishment. Obviously, in Christian terms, it's symbolized by the bread and the wine, and which Swedenborg would say stands for love and wisdom. And so the super substantial bread, which the Cathars talked about, was this spiritual nourishment, or a level of spiritual nourishment, which is also can be grace. But it's the openness to receive something from beyond yourself and not think you can do it all on your own.
Mm. Yes, and of course the bread and the wine in the Eucharist is inseparable from the alchemy of death and resurrection. And maybe for Simone Weil, this decreation that has to take place is that point of consciousness where the immanent and the transcendent can really be known, and we are known by it, and it knows us. So this is the point of realization.
And reciprocity.
And reciprocity is the key, I think, to it.
Yes, the way that Troward tackles this question is interesting, because he says that the God is by definition, or the divine is by definition, universal.
Mm.
And that means that the divine cannot be particular. But in order to create, the particular has to be separated in some way from the universal, and so that we as created self-reflexive beings, we embody the microcosm, which is particular, and of course we can't be universal in that sense, but there's a universal element in us. And I think what Troward was getting at was how do we as particular instantiations of life and consciousness recognize that universal, and know ourselves to be one with it. So
the question there, or the word there you raise, is how, which brings us to the idea of a discipline. How are we nourished adequately for this progress, if we can maybe to have hope is to believe in progress in some sense, maybe not in linear or technological progress, but how important is spiritual discipline in your understanding of this journey of human development?
Well, I think discipline is important anyway, whether it's spiritual discipline, physical discipline. That's probably partly my temperament, because I grew up as a sort of long distance athlete and steeplechaser. And so in order to become good at this, you have to go through a long period of discipline and training, which involves, doing weights and running long distances in the dark and foul weather. And so you don't give up, or you don't just not go out because it's raining or it's very windy. And I still apply this principle. So, for instance, practically every morning I dip in the river, and it's only 10 degrees. It's very cold, but I see that as a form of purification and regeneration on a daily basis. And so I use that as a sort of symbolic process. And then I also pray and meditate in the morning. I try to walk mindfully, particularly in the morning. And I have a number of other practices. I also do physical exercises, some of which are symbolic, and which have formulas with them, and they're related to the Peter Dunoff's idea of the paneurythmy, which is literally means universal harmony of movement, and is a form of sacred dance, where each of the movements represents a spiritual principle. And so there are various different ways in which I myself apply this, and I think it's this refinement process which requires this sort of commitment and focus, without which you're really just drifting along.